Hello and welcome to this latest installment of A Few Minutes With. And today it's my honor to welcome the Reverend Dr. Jan Fuller, currently serving as university chaplain at Elon University. But this isn't a recent thing. She's been a college chaplain for, if I read your bio correctly, about 39 years. And it's taken her from Virginia to New England and all on the Atlantic seaboard. It's been an incredible journey, and because of the added focus on college chaplaincy, particularly during COVID and the ways that it's impacted student life and student activity, I thought this was a very timely conversation to have. And then as part of that as well, she was also a student of Henri Nouwen at Yale. And so this will be an opportunity to talk to someone and get a sense of what Nouwen was like prior to being as well known as he is now, what he was like as a teacher and what it was like to be sitting at a desk in his classroom and learning from him. But we will get to that shortly. But at the outset, Jan, I'd like to welcome you. It's so good to see you again.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, Matt.
In fact, I was thinking you and I actually have known each other for quite a while. You were university chaplain at what was then Hollins College in Roanoke when my wife was a senior there. So we met at commencement and convocation and all sorts of things going on. So it's
been a while.
It has been a while, yeah.
I was younger then. We both were.
Weren't we all? Yeah. Well, before getting into talking about your discernment journey and what led you to college chaplaincy, I have to ask you if you'd be willing to talk a bit about your upbringing and where you spent the first part of your life, because it's a fascinating story.
So I was raised in the Middle East. My parents were missionaries, and they were the kind of missionaries who, some people have an image of missionaries as the mean kind, or the kind who are really out to change everything about the countries that they go to. And my parents were the kind of missionaries who went to the Middle East because they loved Middle Eastern people and culture. And so they basically sort of made that their home and decided that this was our home. And so the early years of living in the Middle East, we lived in Jordan and in Lebanon, and the bulk of our time was in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. But by the time I left to come back to graduate school, I had lived through 4 wars.
Wow.
That was, of course, not the plan. Nobody plans to go to a war zone.
Right.
But lots of people asked us later, why didn't your parents take you out of the country or bring you back to the States? And my own sense of it is, and what they said all along was that that leaving wasn't an option. They had made it their home. They were committed to being there in thick and thin. Mm-hmm. And so what kind of witness would it have been to leave at the first sign of danger? What that meant was that us kids were exposed to things that kids probably shouldn't be exposed to. Mm-hmm. We sat in the hallway. We sat under the dining room table as the bombers came over. We lived through months and months of sort of hiding from, pretending that we weren't there. So we did spend quite a lot of time sort of in hiding in a bomb shelter, in a stairwell. And, mm-hmm. And I really think about that. So if you look at me, you would never know that, right? I don't have the scars of war. I don't look like an Arab, though sound like an Arab. I don't sound like an American when I'm speaking Arabic either. Mm-hmm. So you can look at me and not know anything about my history and my story, and I have to tell you that.
Right.
And one of the things that I have learned about that is that I think that's the way everybody is, right? You can't tell by looking at them what they through, what they, what the centerpieces of their lives are. And so I really think about that. I tell students that all the time, that it's my job to say to them, what's your story? What makes you who you are? Because we can't tell that by looking. And so we have to do that for each other. I think in the church as well. You know, the fact that we're in the pew doesn't say anything about us. In other years, we've been in the pew, right? So I think of that as really allowing me the experience, number one, of being a minority and of understanding a little bit about what it means to be a minority. I was this little blonde girl in a brown country, a Christian in a country where Christians were minorities. And so the other thing that I really benefited from in that upbringing and being a Christian minority was that I really had to think carefully about what is essentially Christian. What does it mean to be Christian in a worldwide way? And what part of Christianity is cultural in the place where we are? I've spent a lot of time thinking about that as I speak to students about their faith, because a lot of what they know about Christian practice cultural, and that's what they assume is essential. And so making the distinction between what is essential Christianity, what are the basic sort of non-negotiables wherever you are, and what is the overlay of culture on our faith. And so then it's helped me think about other religions that way too. So I think that I also, another benefit of growing up in the Middle East was when I came to the United States, I had a background, I knew a lot about Islam, and I knew a lot of Muslims, and I knew enough not to be afraid of Muslims. In the United States, I almost immediately found that very useful. And I eventually discovered, after 2001, I discovered that it was in fact a kind of calling, an addition to the calling I had already experienced on campus, because I knew something about Muslims and the Arab world that Americans did not. And I didn't have the fear and the skepticism and the suspicion. I had not been raised with all of that Islamophobia that a lot of Americans have been exposed to, and have drunk in the water and breathed in the air. And so I began to understand that part of the ministry that I was called to was to teach Christians about Islam as a long and honorable tradition. That has gotten me into trouble sometimes, but I don't regret it one moment. And that was a kind of additional blessing of being overseas that I had not anticipated. You know, as a child, I studied in schools that also taught Islam, right? That was the history and the culture that we were living in. So I really had more of that than I had of the Pilgrims, and so I had to remediate my own American history. But all of that is to say that I count that as a great blessing that I didn't understand when I was really being exposed to it.
You know, you used there were two phrases that jumped out. You talked about your parents and how they strongly felt that leaving the Middle East, leaving a war zone, was not an option for them. And you also used the phrase non-negotiable in talking about, in broad terms, the enactment of Christian faith. How did that willingness to stay in a war zone and to live into that non-negotiable nature of Christian witness, do you remember how that impacted the communities there? Because I'm sure that growing up in an area, growing up in the Middle East, growing up in a war zone and having that be a generational concern, flight and leaving is probably I would guess, and I don't know this, but I would think it's a second nature type thing. Conflict, you avoid conflict, you try and get away from it. How did this non-negotiability and this willingness to stay by your parents and your family, how do you think it impacted the Christian community they were ministering to?
Well, I feel sure of that because when we have returned since then, the Christian community in Lebanon, so this was mostly in Lebanon, but in Lebanon, the Christian community really said to my parents, so the Civil War started in 1975 and ended in 91-ish. And they continued to work in Lebanon until 96, when they retired and came back to the United States. So they had years in which then the Lebanese community, Christian community, could say to them, it would have been your right to leave, but you exhibited with us is that we mattered really more than your comfort, and that you were willing to endure this moment with us, or these years. The fact that you were willing to endure these moments with us really was very convincing in terms of your own sense of following Christ in this moment, your own sense of trusting him rather than your own devices. And it really increased the credibility of their ministries tenfold. And the ministries that they were involved with continue to exist since their retirement. After they retired, so they were Baptist missionaries, and after they retired, the Baptists really withdrew their support from the ministries that they had been doing, a publishing house, a radio ministry, and a seminary. And the Lebanese Baptists, but really the Lebanese evangelical community and the Lebanese Christians said, we're not going to let this go. This is really significant work to us. And so the Lebanese Baptists began to make coalitions across the Christian community and found the funding because these were ministries. I mean, in a country where you're a minority and Baptists were a minority of Christians, there was no way that Baptists could be independent. And so all through the years, that work had been very ecumenical and very broadly supported. The Coptic Church in Egypt had really been very supportive of the publishing that my mom was doing. So they continued to be supportive now, because the books that come out of the publishing house go down to Cairo and are distributed among the Coptic churches down there.
It's incredible.
When Christians are a minority, they have to work together. Not like we are in the US, right? Where everybody is really independent, and because we have our own way of doing things and we don't really create very many coalitions. It was very different in the Middle East. You had to have a coalition, you had to have a community, or you couldn't survive.
Yeah.
So now your immediate question is escaping me, but that was really the response to their staying in Lebanon was honor, respect, and the people were like, we're sure of your commitment, because it would be easy to be with us when times were great.
Yeah.
When it was like a paradise, but the nature of your commitment is more obvious when things are hard.
And I love hearing that when your parents left and the church wanted to close everything down, and so the community there picked everything up. What a wonderful and powerful way of picking up that non-negotiable nature of what your parents had been living out and taking it upon themselves, saying, no, closing is no longer an option for us either. It's not negotiable. We're going to do this ourselves. That's incredibly powerful. How do you think the time there when you were in the Middle East impacted your discernment in broad terms to ministry and specifically to chaplaincy?
Well, it's clearly all wrapped up in that. You know, I really, as I look back, my recollection, I have a recollection of being 11 years old and throwing myself down on my bed in big tears, in a kind of, you know, 11-year-old angst, because at that moment I realized that I was going to have to choose between being smart and being faithful. That as a girl and as a Baptist, remember, I could not do both. So then in college, I realized that I was wrong about that. I saw chaplains and campus ministers really engaging those questions with me and helping me to deepen my own faith and helping me to understand that intellect and faith go hand in hand. And think in such a way that enhances your faith and practice, and you can practice in such a way that enhances your intellectual development. That in fact, we're whole people, and you didn't have to decide, that I didn't have to decide between those.
Right.
When I was in college, I began to think about, you know, my campus ministers and my chaplains, and I really thought every single thing that they do, I love doing. And because I had this underlay of faith and intellect, and that's what I was doing, I was developing those parts of myself at college. I really began to understand that that was what I wanted to do. I knew that I wasn't the only person who had struggled with, can you think about your faith? Is it possible? Is it reasonable to think about your Christian faith? Is it reasonable to ask the tough question? Now I understand that asking the tough questions is part of the developmental moment that college is. Asking the questions, even, do I need a religion? And if I do, which religion will it be? Those are part, you know, what kind of person do I want to be in the world? How am I complicit in systems of injustice? And how do I want to work for justice? What kind of mark do I want to make on the world? What kind of family do I want to build? All of those are questions that get decided, or the beginnings of those questions, beginnings of those answers begin to appear in college. When you make a decision about a major, and when you make a decision about a first job, and about relationships, and about your own sexual identities, and how you're going to live all this out. And so I understand that now, and I see as I look back that that's what was happening to me, that I understood that I could hold together my faith and my intellect, and they didn't have to be separate entities in my life. So I understand that, and I understood that at the time as a calling to be with people who were in the same kind of divided state, and to see, and as the years have gone by, I see chaplaincy as a way of making us whole, of inviting all the pieces of ourselves into the conversation about who we are and who we'll be in the world, and what part our faith plays in, say, our career, or what part our faith plays in just what we love and who we love, and how we live out the joys and passions of our lives. So I see that now, you know, after some time looking back, I see that as all connected to that question of whether you have to be a divided person. And I eventually, when I joined the Episcopal Church, I was looking for a place that would welcome the whole of me, right? That would welcome my questions. Because as the longer I live, the more I realize that faith doesn't provide me answers.
Yeah.
If there were answers, it wouldn't be faith, right? If I had concrete evidentiary proof, I wouldn't need faith at all. So that the questions linger in my own self, and they are part of my practice, right? And part of who I am as a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll say one more thing about that.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
When I was so in my first year at Yale, I had a campus ministry placement with the Baptist chaplain at Yale.
Mm-hmm.
And early on in our meetings, he said to me, "What would you die for?" Now, that was a really difficult and painful question for me, because I had fled Lebanon. I had come back to the States to go to graduate school at Yale.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying not to die. I had spent so much time trying not to die.
Right.
Now he was asking me what I would die for. And I was like, I don't even want to think about that. Well, it was in the back of my mind for the better part of a year. I said to him, I'm just going to have to think about that. There's no way I can answer that. So I went through I went through the list of, would I die for my family? Would I die for any theoretical children I would have? Would I die for the rights of my gay and lesbian friends in the world? Would I die for, I just kind of went down the list, and I didn't find anything that would be useful upon my death. I couldn't find any use for my own death. In the end, I'm really abbreviating the story, but in the end, I thought to myself, if I would die for peace in the Middle East,
Mm-hmm.
even though I understood, and I continue to understand, that my death would not achieve this. Not being Jesus and all, but I understood that I would die for that if I thought it would bring that about. And so in the end, I went to see my supervisor. I was talking with him weekly, I think. And at one point, then I said to him, so I figured out the answer to this question. I said to him, I would die for peace in the Middle East. But I recognize that that's not going to happen, that my death would accomplish nothing.
Right.
But I've also begun to recognize that I could live for that. If I would die for it, then I would probably live for it. And I think that that's the meaning of your question that you asked me, and
Mm-hmm.
I would answer it, right? And so in my life, as I've continued to live it in the meantime, and then I took his job as he left, and that was my first year. But I began to understand that if I could, in my own life, make a difference for the cause of peace, that I would have considered my life well lived. That I wanted, and my chapter itself out, is that if my ministry would have been a drop in the bucket for the sake of peace among human beings and peace in the Middle East ultimately, then that was going to be a richly lived and a wonderful ministry. Now, I have a lot of living still to do.
Yeah.
But I do think, and that's what's asked the faith of me, is what I'm doing making a difference for the cause of the world? I keep asking myself that question year after year after year. And some days I can answer it, and some days I can't. And some days I can point to, in my exam, in ways that I think I am helping to move the needle in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
And then some days it just is an element of faith that I just simply have faith that it will matter in the end.
You know, and listening to you talk about that again, that phrase non-negotiable came up because as you reflected on the answer that you were asked, or to the question you were asked about what would you die for, the answer that you came to still reflects some of that non-negotiable nature of things. But in listening to it too, between that question from that Baptist chaplain as your advisor and some of the other things that you've talked about in chaplaincy, it goes to the point that I think many people don't realize that, unlike a lot of other things in the Episcopal Church specifically, there are a lot of non-quantifiable things that a chaplain does. You know, in a parish, it's how many people came on Sunday, how many Eucharists did we have in the last year? There's a much broader, less quantifiable way to explain what a chaplain does. It's not something that fits easily into a parochial report. What do you find as people begin to encounter you as a chaplain, as a advisor and mentor and that sort of thing, together with the ecumenical group and interfaith group of chaplains? What do people find when they realize chaplains are there for so much more than a service on Sunday?
Mm-hmm. So people will discover if there's a crisis, I'm going to be involved in it. That there's no difference, I think, though it's different how we do that, but there's no difference in how we are involved in, say, a death in our community. Mm-hmm. The way you would be involved in a death in a parish community, except that I don't do funerals, right? As the university chaplain, people have their family clergy or not, and I lead services I would lead a memorial on campus. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't bury very many people in that way. So, but the chaplain of a university is really the hub of the caring network. Mm-hmm. Not the only one, but there's a lot of rallying, caring folks in a moment of crisis, and the chaplain will always be at the center of some kind of crisis on campus. Right. And more than that, I think the chaplain is here to ask questions of students, of faculty and staff, of the system. Sometimes we have to be the one to name where the pain is in our community. Mm-hmm. So a chaplain is listening to the whole community, and listening to the stories. I used to, when I was at Hollins, and it was a much smaller community, I used to go through the directory and I would ask myself, do I know something about this person's story? Mm-hmm. And that was an evidence to me. And I would just go down and I would just count them, right? That, you know, there's a lot of ways that we have to learn to define our own success. And that was one that I used while I was at Hollins. Mm-hmm. Down the faculty and staff directory, and I would go down the student directory, and I would think, do I know something about this person's story? Like, have I encountered them at a level that I clearly know their name, and I know something about who they are as a human being? Yeah. So are they a human being in my eyes, and not a number or, you know, an ID? And a small community, it's easier to do that.
Sure. Yeah.
But a chaplain is often a teacher. So I have taught for years as a part of chaplaincy, again, raising those questions, helping students identify what their values are and how they're going to live them out in the world, and what that has to do with where they are going career-wise. Mm-hmm. So as a university chaplain, I'm not connected to any one faith tradition, right? I mean, I don't represent any one faith tradition. I am here as a representative of faith, or of religion, or of spiritual quest. And And it's less important, and in my role as the university chaplain, it's less important that I help students identify their denominational perspective. Our students, the students of this moment are post-denominational. They don't give one hoot about that.
Right.
They are not defined by that. They want a meaningful practice. They want a meaningful set of connections. And where they find that is where they're going to land and how they're going to identify. And we have great numbers of students who come from parents who are mixed religion. So they might be Jewish and Buddhist, or they might be Christian and Jewish, or they might be Muslim and Christian. A lot of our students are really belonging in multiple ways to religious communities. That's going to be a challenge. These are the students who are coming out of universities and are challenge our churches to understand, to redefine what membership is and what belonging is in our religious communities. Because our students are completely comfortable with being two things. Right? And practicing two ways and holding it together in a way that many of their parents and grandparents have no idea how to do. So they're really challenging us.
You touched on something really important when you were talking about college students wanting connection. As an Episcopal priest, you're aware of this. As an Episcopal priest in a parish, I'm keenly aware of this. We're a denomination that's in decline. And much of the conversation, and I'm guilty of this, has been, how can we offer more exciting liturgy? How can we offer more exciting outreach? How can we offer programmatic involvement? But the thing that I'm not hearing, and maybe I've missed it, but I'm not hearing, how can we get people connected? And I'm so glad you talked about connection, because, again, I may have missed it, but that seems to be the thing that, certainly for me, and it's given me something to think about now, it's about getting people connected, and liturgy grows out of that, and programs grow out of that, and outreach grows out of that. It's not the inverse. And I think a lot of us are looking at it backwards.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Matt, because one of the things that so as the university chaplain now, I am responsible for programming, and I could talk about that in a minute. But what I say about programming to students is that programming is not for its own sake. A program is a platform for connection. It's a platform for relationship. And our students are looking for relationship that matters, relationship that brings stimulation and joy, and that helps them define who they are. So I think that's what we're looking for in church. We're not looking for liturgy. We're not looking for the pure theological truth. We're looking for connection with each other and with Jesus, right? With Christ.
Right.
And even with ourselves. So I think, one of the things I love about being a chaplain is that it is a kind of unencumbered, it's a clear path. It's about relationship. It's not anything else. It's not about are my classes oversubscribed? Well, who cares, right? Am I making relationships with students that will matter to them in the end? And usually, it's 10 or 15 years before we know. Before students will come back 10 years later and say, you mattered in my story. They didn't know that at the time. So even the life of a chaplain is an act of faith that this will matter somewhere down the road. Even though I don't know how it matters right this minute. Some days I do, right? I meet with students and I think, oh, that was so powerful.
Right.
What happened here? And other times I don't remember. And 10 years later, they'll come back and say, you remember that day when you said XYZ? And I'm like, nope, I don't. And they'll say, well, that really turned something in me. That's a moment that I remember that turned me in a new direction. And so I just have to keep having the faith that it matters, right? That these relationships matter.
Yeah.
think you're right. That's what church is. That's what church is. Right? We are a community in search of connection with ourselves, with each other, with Christ, with God. That's what matters.
I think it's almost flipping the Field of Dreams model on its head. In the movie, if you build it, they will come. And I think we need to be more focused on get them to come and then build it. After that, get them there and connected and then grow out of that.
Or we can, how did you end up in the church where you grew up? Well, somebody brought you.
Mm-hmm.
You had a connection with somebody. Now, maybe it was your parents at the time, but I ended up in the Episcopal Church because I had a friend who brought me.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you come? I was looking, right? I was looking hard for a church that would accept me as a woman, that would accept me as a person who wanted to continue to be, to live the questions rather than answers. I think we're looking for a place to belong that will accept us where we are and who we are.
Amen to that.
I think that's what chaplains do.
Yeah.
We don't fix things. We just love people where they are.
That's great. Well, I'm certainly grateful that you do what you do. And I've seen the impact on, again, my now wife was one of your students at Hollins, and I know the impact you made on her. So I'm personally grateful just from my own secondhand experience of watching that at play. I want to shift gears for the few minutes that we have left and talk about, probably not at the time, but now, the person that would be considered probably your most famous teacher, Henri Nouwen, during your time at Yale. And to go into that, I'm going to now play an audio clip of Nouwen speaking at the Crystal Cathedral in 1993. And I think in this 1 minute or so clip that you're about to hear, I think it summarizes to a T the life and the work and the ministry of Henri Nouwen. So let's take a moment and enjoy that.
I'm really grateful to be with you here this morning and to share my faith with you. And to the core of that faith belongs my conviction that you and that I and that we are the beloved daughters and sons of God. I might as well say that from the very beginning. We are the beloved sons and daughters of God. And one of the enormous spiritual tasks we have is to claim that and to live a life based on that knowledge. And that's not very easy. In fact, most of us fail constantly to claim the truths of who we are.
So that was Henri Nouwen, and I'm sure that voice sounds very familiar. I have to ask, again, he wasn't famous at the point when you first came to Yale in the late 70s. When you first encountered him and came into his first class, did you have a set of expectations from what you'd heard from other students, or were you a blank slate when you walked in?
Well, I registered for his class. I took his class in compassion, and I took it because other students were talking about it. So he was already a little bit famous in the Yale divinity community.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That there were students who were talking about this man who was really challenging our spiritual development. And so I registered for the class because I thought, well, let me see what all this is about. There was a lot of talk and I wanted to see. And what I found in the class, I found him to be, I thought my experience at Yale was that we were, and again, this is back to my story about being sort of a divided soul. So is spiritual life connected to your intellectual life? And at the divinity school, I didn't find that, I thought a lot of us were struggling with how to hold all that together. Mm-hmm. And in Henri's class, there was not a division. So we were thinking about what we were feeling, and we were feeling what we were thinking, and we were, and he was in his classes building community. That he did that, and he was inviting our hearts into the classroom in a way that it was not overtly expected in other places. So he was challenging the mode and of, Western higher education, I suppose, and inviting our spiritual natures into his classroom. There was lots of silence in class. We always began with silence. And I didn't have the sense that he really cared what we wrote, like we were writing in response to our course material, but I didn't have the sense that any of that was terribly important to him. That the substance of what we were writing, but that we were writing was the goal. He had TAs, John McGabgab was there as his TA, and he was the person, if you had a question about your writing, you would go to John.
Right.
And I always felt like, Henri was a little bit removed from the grading papers, responding to papers, but it mattered that we were there in his class and we were writing, but he didn't intellectually engage us in our papers.
Yeah.
That's something I found curious. Now, I will tell you that in the end, the book that he wrote a book called Life of the Beloved.
Yep.
After I knew him, I think he left Yale, although it's a story of a relationship that he had with a young man while he was at Yale. And I treasure this book, and I hold on to it. I read it all the time, and I give copies of it away. I'll buy it 5 and 10 copies at once, and I give it away. And the reason I do that is that he tells the story of he tells the Christian story to a young Jewish reporter. This Jewish reporter is also not religious. And so what Henri is doing in this story is trying to translate the story of Christianity for a non-believer. And it really goes back to that set of questions in my own mind about what is the essential, not negotiable Christian story.
Right.
And of course, as a college chaplain, I have worked really hard to get Christian language out of my vocabulary. Because students, it's a conversation stopper. It does not help us in the conversation. So I spend a lot of time translating religious or spiritual concepts into secular words, right? I don't want to use any words that presume a kind of connection to faith or a tradition. So I've spent my life learning to talk about my faith in a secular way. And when I found the Life of the Beloved, I recognized that impetus in Henri as well, that he was trying to translate his faith into language that wasn't churchy language. And I recognized a fellow pilgrim in that book that I hadn't known while I was at Yale. And, Henri was teaching divinity students. He wasn't teaching, secular people. We weren't any of us secular at the time. Though I suspect in seminaries we have, at Yale, there are a lot more secular people now who are searching for where they belong in the spiritual pilgrimage. But so in a way, it was after the fact that his real impact became clear to me in that longing to tell the story in a way that wasn't full of the trappings of cultural religion, or even theological language. So how do we tell the story of Jesus without using any religious language?
What was his style? You know, you mentioned at the beginning of class it was always silence. And my only encounters with Nouwen are watching him lecture and speak, and it's a very one-directional relationship. For me, it's just observing. Did he speak and you responded, or did he throw things out and respond to what you all were saying, or was it just, did it vary depending on the spirit in the room?
My recollection is that it was a kind of lecture, only I think he was thinking out loud. I don't think that he came, you know, I have professors who would come to class with an outline and hand out the outline and would follow the outline as they were lecturing. Well, Nouwen, of course, wasn't like that. He would start with a word and just go off. So it was almost like you were hearing what he was thinking about today. And there wasn't a lot of give and take in the class itself. I think there, you know, Henri was a shy sort of, he wasn't, I wouldn't call him an extrovert at all. I didn't think he had any of those tendencies. And so I think having a rousing discussion in class was just not his style.
Yeah.
So I came really not to expect that. And sometimes even I would go to class and I would stop taking notes because I would want just to have the experience, right? And I think that that's part of what he was offering us. And the substance of what we would do every day would just have to wash over you. Now we did meet in small groups after that. So we would have the lecture and then we would meet in small groups to talk about what we had learned. And I will tell you that there were students who, like Henri groupies, they were just like little Henrys. And I mean, that was really annoying to me because you just have to like, and who are you really? You're not another Henri Nouwen, right? So I was, again, a kind of, I wasn't obnoxious. I myself was a little bit shy, and I was dealing with some culture shock in my years at Yale from having come out of the war. And anyway, so I was a little bit introverted myself in terms of being able to say what I was really thinking. But I really mistrusted the people who were just sort of, oh, I'm getting all spiritual on myself, you know.
Yeah.
And I really thought, I don't think this is what Henri wanted either for us. That he wasn't trying to make us Henrys. He was trying to invite us into a rich spiritual life. And I didn't have the sense that he was altogether happy at Yale. It was something to do for a season. And I think working with kind of privileged white students was not his best kind of calling. I think that he probably didn't think that was what, I mean, I didn't know what he was thinking, but
Sure.
perception of it was that it was not the best fit for him, especially after I saw him go. But I'll always be grateful for the spiritual nature of his classes. And I think that gave me a rooting in my own faith and my own practice of silence that has stood me in good stead all these years. That has really rooted me and kept me connected to my own heart, my own kind of spiritual curiosity.
Well, I have to say here at the close, I've enjoyed this time, but you're talking about deep roots, and everything you've shared for me as someone learning about your journey and a bit about your vocational life you have roots in many places. And I think it's such a gift that you're giving to all of us, giving to your students. But I also think it's a reflection of the many gifts, starting with being the child of missionaries in a war zone in the Middle East, through your time at Yale and Hollins and Elon and all these places that you've been. I think it's very much a mutuality of giving and receiving gifts. So, you know I speak for former students, again, married to one, but students you have now and people in general. I just thank you for that mutuality that you've not only received with gratitude, but that you give with joy. So thank you so much.
I thank you, Matt. It's been great to be with you. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Great to see you. Take care. God
All right.
bless.
Thank you. You too.